Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Faith Unaltered. It's going to be a good one. Unfortunately, our brother Tyler was not able to come tonight. He had work, so pray the Lord blesses him in his workplace anyway. Tonight, we're going to be talking about a little bit more of the kind of ecumenical flavor that Faith Unaltered has tried to make its mainstay attitude in order to be welcoming and open, to have clarity and charity in our conversations with people, even if we disagree with them. And so tonight we're going to explore and expound on that a little bit. As you saw in the overlay, having meaningful conversations. And I can say that I've had a lot of conversations here on the podcast and over time that have been primarily with people that I disagree with. And so I can say that you can have decent, productive, and meaningful conversations even with people you have strong disagreements with. But I think in this conversation, we're going to try to settle into a groove where we discuss what it's like to have those good in-house discussions, if I'm understanding properly, is to look at each other, take each other seriously, and not try to confine one another, if that makes sense. And so tonight is going to be us, Amber, and Carrie. I don't think I've been on a stream with the two of you guys other than an open mic.
Probably not. Yeah, this is fun.
This is pretty cool. How you guys doing tonight?
All right, it's Friday, I guess.
It's Friday. It is Friday. You're right about that. It's technically my Thursday, but we'll see. Oh, you're muted, Amber.
The mute button hates me. I just have to say that up front. It does. It hates me a lot. It's the bane of my existence sometimes. Anyway, I got the awesome chance this morning to go hear N.T. Wright speak. So that was totally amazing. I was blown away. I loved it. Gave me a lot to think about and actually really kind of helped push where I was thinking in this conversation tonight. But overall, things are happening. School is good, and there's some other things that are going on that I'm just not ready to talk about right now. But life is, like Courtney talked about the other day. We don't want balance in the force. We want thing to be good all the time, because balance in the force means that evil happens. But life is life, and evil happens sometimes. So we're living in that season in my house right now. So Courtney, how are you? Or Carrie, I'm sorry. I tell you, my
brain on autopilot.
You know what? That's what this conversation might be, is we can't speak sentences, and that's okay. I'm there with you, not being able to speak sentences. So yeah.
You're so sorry.
You're good. Hey, starts with a C. What do we say?
It does start with a C. You're right, but at least it's the same letter. Yeah.
Well, and nobody has ever gotten my name right in various ways throughout my entire life. So it is what it is.
How often are you called Tari?
Pretty often, and nobody knows how to spell it, which is really amusing to me, because it's not that hard, but it's really a rare spelling. So which I've always thought that was funny. But
I used to get a real kick out of when I was a little kid, and telemarketers would call my house asking for my mother, because her name is Penelope Mueller, and people, especially with the language barrier, would get on the phone and be, "Can I speak to Penelope Mueller? Penelope Mueller?" Nope, she don't live here. So let's start out a little bit. We got what exactly is the mission statement of the conversation tonight? I know both of you guys had mentioned a previous episode where Carrie had made a statement about people generalizing too much. Like what exactly is it that this kind of sparked the conversation for you guys?
I think I'll go, because this is kind of my brainchild, and you guys are just kind of here for the ride. So this could be a little wild and bumpy here. But when we were doing the Sacred Spaces episode for Troy, Carrie started off with, well, I'm here to put a burr in the saddle and to interject some things in the conversation, and to really kind of bring to everybody's attention, remembering that as we're having conversations about bigger like groups of people, or in that context it was ancient Near East of like Babylonians versus ancient Hebrews, and as we're labeling and grouping people together, sometimes we have a tendency to forget that there's humans and people with souls and lives involved in that, and it can become very black and white, overly binary, and sometimes a little bit disrespectful of the hearts and intentions of the people within those groups. And that really just kind of has put a pebble in my mental shoe on just about everything now in a lot of my things that I'm doing.
People sometimes.
It's been I've been meaning to thank you, actually, because it's been great. And it's been, as I've been doing my my homework for school, and I have a New Testament interpretation class, so I get to use that burr in the saddle that you gave us in that conversation to really bring some of that into those conversations. And so now my professor thinks I'm like the greatest thing ever, but it's really because Carrie put a pebble in my mental shoe that won't go away. So this really kind of came out of, and then after that Sacred Spaces episode, just watching some more of the conversations that I get to be involved in, either here in this YouTube space or watching conversations that have been happening on X, Twitter over there a little bit, because I dabble in that swamp every so often, and try to be a positive voice of just being me. But it really strikes me how in the back and forth between, I see a lot of things like, well, I don't understand how someone could be Orthodox or Roman Catholic, and you have to surrender your thinking and give up your brain, and, to let somebody else control your life and your everything else. And I don't see how Protestants can be so emotional and, like in love with themselves, and just think there's so many things in these portrayals of these conversations that are dehumanizing and disrespectful to the fact that I think a lot of us on the day-to-day personal level are sincerely trying to do the best we can to follow Jesus in the way that we have in the context that we're in. And so I want to really bring some attention and talk about, like, how do we have these higher level conversations, but at the same time honor the fact that doesn't, dehumanize or strip the sincerity out of the individual people involved. So that's kind of where this came from.
Yeah. Well, and I had a conversation this morning. Well, so it wasn't really a conversation. I asked 2 questions, and then I got accused of being a Jehovah's Witness. So I'm still trying to process where exactly that came from, because I literally only asked 2 questions. And like, okay, I really don't know how that came to be. So to me, that just reminds me of, like, we tend to come at this as defensive already. Like, we enter the conversation with our boots strapped on, like we're ready to fight, instead of ready to listen or trying to tell where somebody is in something. It's like, okay, where is our actual aim for the conversation? Am I trying to prove myself right? And here I am. And there's a space for that, right? We have to be able to take our stand. We need to be able to say what we want to say, but there's also a really good time and place to step back and listen to the other person, and not just jump to some conclusion that is wildly crazy. So.
Yeah, and it made me I had a thought there, and I don't know, this may be further downstream or not, but we'll just kind of jump in here midway, because it seems like in what Carrie said that sparked another thought, that as we come into these conversations, that we're so used to them being combative, and we're so used to everything being a disagreement, that I wonder if, as like part of like one of the things, the conversations I was that I'm having over on When Deep Calls Deep, and that Tyler and I talked a lot about in this Ecclesia project that we're working on. Like, how do we spend some time learning how to agree for a while? Because we're so used to disagreeing. We just automatically come in, like Carrie said, with a posture of defensiveness. We come in with the rocks and the sticks, with our battle armor on. And it's so easy to see the warrior and to not see the heart of the person. And so how do we kind of step back, first of all, to take that gear off and just agree for a little while and heal for a little bit? Because I don't know that some of that's just not collective trauma of the
Right.
religious fighting that we just absorb by proxy of being in and exposed to all these conversations.
Well, I can say, as somebody who has conversations with people that are not of the same denomination often, even on my segment, one of the things that saves me is honestly having conversations that are bigger than doctrine. And what I mean by that is all the things that I talk about on Cosmic Corner. If you go back and you look at my backlog of Cosmic Corner playlist, I've been doing this for over a year and a half, and not once have we had a conversation explicitly about doctrine. But all my conversations last half hour or an hour and a half to 2 hours. There are 5-6 people, all from very diverse faith backgrounds, talking about things that are scripturally relevant and practically relevant. And not yet has anything devolved into anything like a debate. I'm very pleased with how that's gone. But it's also because of the fact that the exercises that I'm doing in having those conversations are ones that are very balanced in terms of how we use our mental faculties, right? And so I think one of the reasons that a lot of this stuff goes sour is because people start out, first of all, hyper focused on minutia, and that's where all of the initial disagreement actually lives. The further you zoom out, the more likely you are to see overlap. And so people are so far zoomed in at the wrong level of resolution when they begin the conversation that they don't end it on anything reasonable at all, because they've started by trying to look at atoms and explain how molecules work, and looked at molecules to explain how cells work, and looked at cells to explain how the bios works, rather than starting all the way zoomed out and then zooming into particulars from there. So we're just reverse engineering conversations stupidly. I think we're just looking at it from far, far too close, and then not learning how to zoom back out to look at where exactly does the disagreement live, because it's not just this one thing. Having a conversation probably thousands of times about Romans chapter 9 as somebody who's a non-Calvinist, who used to be a Calvinist, who's had the Calvinism conversation lots of times, right? Coming back to Romans chapter 9, usually what I'll do instead, if somebody brings up Romans chapter 9, is I'll start in Romans chapter 3, because it makes a perfect parallel, and it zooms us out to the fact that there are several chapters between the two, and they have a context. And Romans 9 is not living by itself in the ether, right? So you can't zoom in and pretend the rest of the world doesn't exist for the sake of the point that you're making if the conversation doesn't actually have something beyond that individuated point. And that's usually a sign that the person you're talking to is not looking for correction, is not even looking to be correct. They're just looking to feel correct. And so usually those conversations are not exactly worth having in the long term. And then the second thing that I would point out is this is far more prominent in a digital space in which you have no personhood to deal with. You're looking at a screen, you're looking at a little avatar on the screen, and the words that are typed, and all of that stuff comes back to a part of your brain that doesn't know how persons work. It only thinks in mechanisms, and it thinks in data. It thinks in decontextualized points of reference and information. It doesn't deal with persons. And so there's so many things that go into that I think we're doing wrong, that are really rampant in the intellectual community, because, well, as intellectuals, we're not exactly emotionally intelligent.
Right.
Yeah. So, Josh, what would you do if you were in a conversation that you would normally find yourself in on Facebook or wherever else, and somebody is coming at things from that really stringent point of view? What would be a good suggestion of how to approach that to help zoom it out instead of dig in? Because one way you could do it is to be curious and ask them more questions, but that might also zoom too much into the conversation in a way that's unhelpful, perhaps. What do you think?
Usually what I do in order to foster the better conversation when I find somebody are starting out zoomed in that way is I'll try to drop their point in a context of something larger, and I'll make their point for them. If I'm being charitable, usually what I'll do, especially if I'm talking to, let's say, a Calvinist, because it's somebody that I have that previous historical overlap with, because I was a Calvinist. I can articulate Calvinism probably better than a lot of Calvinists can. And if I were to make a fake account and go on Facebook or YouTube and start spouting Calvinist stuff, people would wholeheartedly believe that I was a Calvinist because I know how to stage it. I know exactly the right words, right? And so if you can speak the language, and this is something that not everybody has, but if you have the backdrop of understanding someone else's position and you can speak the language, grant them the language so that they know that you take them seriously, so that when you say, hey, the problem I think actually lives further upstream, let's zoom out from there, they're not going to go, well, you're just jumping from the point. No, I get your point. Right? And I've established that I get your point. The other thing that I like to do personally is if I'm online and I feel like somebody is having a conversation, they're too zoomed in, but I don't feel like the conversation is going to go in a way that's reasonable or as nuanced or as clarified as I think it should be. Usually what I'll do is I'll actually I'll recommend to the person that we leave social media with the conversation and have a phone call or a video chat. So I'm talking to a person and not to a screen necessarily, right? Because it's a lot easier to have a reasonable conversation, even with a disembodied voice from a cell phone, than it is with simple words on a screen. It's too impersonal, and it doesn't give you the ability to have the overlapping generality that conversation gives. Dialogue doesn't happen in confined spaces with, like, in a debate, you have timed responses and so forth. But, in terms of what we're doing here, you can tell when I'm done speaking, but even if I'm not, you can interject and ask a clarifying question before I get 10 miles into my thought. And now I have to backtrack 10 miles to get to where your concern was. Right. And so it lends itself to that clarity. It lends itself to treating the other person as a person. Right. And so one of my favorite things to do is just offer an actual conversation. I'll tell people, hey, I don't think that comment threads lend themselves to nuanced clarity. Would you like to have a real conversation about this? Because I'll make myself available. People that want to have the conversation will usually take for granted, or will usually not take for granted, that you're offering your time and attention. And so I think that's probably one of the ways, practically speaking, that you can take things off of the combative court and bring them into something that's a lot less battle fueled and a lot more like common ground fueled. I had a conversation just the other day with a guy I'm friends with on Facebook named Brandon. He had made a post, and the post was literally just one sentence question about should women lead or should women follow? That is a minefield. And so I told him, I don't think that comment threads lend themselves to the kind of clarity necessary for that conversation. Would you be okay with talking with me about it? He was like, yeah, I think that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. He sent me a message, sent me his phone number. I called him. We talked for an hour and a half. And by the end of that, he was like super blessed. I was super blessed. I have a new friend rather than a new enemy. And so a real conversation goes a long way. It really does.
But I wonder if some of that, because we are going to be involved in bigger conversations going forward here with the Ecclesia Project and in dialoguing in multi-ecumenical conversations, like how do we keep that in mind when we're having the bigger step out conversations? Because I know, like, I've got some things planned, like we're going to do an episode or two on a Protestant's guide to understanding Roman Catholic and Orthodox vocabulary. So we're just going to sit down, and I have somebody who's a Catholic representative and an Orthodox representative, and we're going to talk about things like, it really struck me like over Christmas that we just finished with Christmas and the Nativity. And I was listening to some friends talking about some different things, and I was watching Twitter, and I saw a Roman Catholic friend post up something about celebrating the Immaculate Conception. And a lot of Protestants were like, yeah, we were all down with that. And I'm like, no, you're not. You don't know what that, you don't, if you're saying that, you don't understand what they're saying, right? Like kind of thing. And so we're going to have a conversation about, what are some of these terms that seem like they might be interchangeable, but they're not. And so when a Protestant's asking a Roman Catholic or responding to something, like what do those things mean, and making a generic, like a dictionary or kind of a reference point for the rest of some of these conversations, which I'm really excited about that coming up, and some of these where we're going to be talking about, like Roman Catholic perspective and Eastern Orthodox perspective and the range and the Protestant perspective, because that's you're dealing in the bigger, higher hypothetical there. But we don't want to frame those in such a way that assumes that because I am right, I'm technically Protestant, that I don't frame the way that I'm talking about my Catholic brothers and sisters, that automatically they're not sincere in their faith because they're Catholic. They have to be, lesser intelligent, lesser faithful, lesser able to understand the Bible because they choose to be Catholic or Orthodox or Anglican. Like, how do we frame the conversations to not automatically assume those divisions in the way that we're framing our conversations?
Good stuff. It reminds me of so I recently was looking at this comes from a Lutheran church. It's a Bible study, and at the end of it, it's got a list of basically soteriology for different groups. And I'm reading through it, and I'm like, I don't know as though any of these people would agree with the way that they are presenting the other sides. And that comes from a place where I could see at multiple places where I understood it from a non-Lutheran perspective. And I'm like, that's not how I would describe it. And the way they were describing it, I'd be like, well, that's heresy. And that's not what I would agree with, So, and it's so easy to do that. And it's coming from a good heart. Like they're trying to present all of the soteriology of the different groups in the same framework so that you can theoretically compare them. And I'm like, well, is that even fair to attempt when they're so vastly different? They don't really fit together in one picture in that way. And so really understanding terminology from different perspectives is really crucial.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's probably also wisdom in being able to recognize that when you're talking to somebody who doesn't use the same framework that you're using, and this is what I meant before, is having the backdrop of some real, not the fabricated hero worship understanding you get when you listen to John MacArthur talk about non-Calvinists. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about actually understanding in reality some general understanding of the view of the person you're talking to. The other difficulty that comes out of this is the person you're talking to might actually not have a cogent view of things. Mm-hmm. They might be doing one of the mainstay Protestant problems, which is this theology a la carte problem, where it's like, I'll take what I like, I'll spit out the rest because I'll call it bones, and just ignore the fact that most of these ideas, which that's what they are, ideas have price tags, right? Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the time, the entire conversation gets muddled in the fact that you're trying to even figure out and nail down this person into a category when they don't in fact actually fit one, because they've negated category by figuring out for themselves how to structure something, this kind of Franken theology, right? And so it's like, I'm saying that in jest because I'm actually one of those people that I would call a liturgical leaning mutt, right? I have a ridiculous array of influences, but it gives me the advantage of knowing when I don't know what I'm talking about, right? And so sometimes there's a huge advantage in being really ambiguous and living in that gray space. That's how I am, and I can admit that's how I am. But it also gives the disadvantage for the person I'm talking to not be able to relegate me to one group or another to simplify the problem. They're forced then to deal with me as an individual. Most people are not aware that that's what they're doing. And they think that they have a monolithic, this is the biblical truth kind of view, right? And so when they assert themselves with that level of confidence, and then you ask one question like, have you ever read the early church? And their confidence is, I don't need anything but scripture. Like, that person is probably not on the level of resolution that you're on to even have that conversation. And so be prepared with that person to either walk away or play the long game. There's literally no in between. You're not going to convince that person to adopt your framework in one conversation. That's not happening.
Or even necessarily understand your framework, or any in between, like in any space that we can walk here to explore what we're looking at.
Right, exactly. And so a lot of the time, in order to have those conversations, if you're willing to play the long game, most of the beginning of your conversation will be asking clarifying questions until the person gives you a question mark instead of an answer. Then you found the boundary of some level of ignorance that they have that you can both acknowledge and say, okay, here we are. We found a dark spot in your map. Let's figure out what lives here. And that affords the ability to zoom out without feeling like you're trying to guide the person or be manipulative or however that's going to be perceived. Because it's not just the way that we're talking, we're thinking, we're attempting a conversation. The fact that we're talking to another person complicates the entire thing, because you don't know if that other person has any intention of treating you like an equal or like a person or like your thoughts matter and so forth. Right. And so a lot of the time we'll go into a conversation ready to be charitable, and we're met with non-charitable answers. At that point, one of the things that comes up is the fact that, like, okay, if you're going to enter the apologetic space and you're not able to simply absorb the disdain of other people who don't like how you think, you're probably not in the right headspace to take the conversation any further. And it would be wise for that person to recognize their own deficit, their own shortcoming. I don't have the patience to deal with this person who talks to me this way or thinks this way, and I need to back off. Right. And so it's not always necessarily that like you're mistreating someone. Sometimes it's you're on the receiving end of that. And it's like, I'm not going to be able to maintain my countenance during this conversation sufficiently to be the example I want to be to this person. So I need to zoom out. I need to just back off and leave it alone. You know what I mean? And so knowing when to hold them, knowing when to fold them sort of situation.
Yeah, I've had a couple of interactions the last couple of weeks where I had like a friend who posted up something about Orthodox surrendering their decision making and their thinking to the church and just kind of checking out, and that was not kosher with them. And this is somebody I'm friends enough, and I know how they operate and the way that they think and just kind of their posturing. So I pushed back on them, and it was like, hey, do you actually know anybody who's Orthodox? Have you actually read anything that's Orthodox? Where are you getting this assumption from? And in my pushing back with him, now he's reading two different books, one about how the Orthodox mind and how it works, and one about the Orthodox tradition and the Orthodox love of tradition. So that, like that for that person, that really worked. And then somebody else that I know who, this is like a Twitter connection, who is very in a certain niche of theology, and has actually started to, because of a lot of different interactions that they've had with people lately, started to show a little bit of cracks of being open to other perspectives. And so he was asking like, hey, do you know good podcasts to go listen to? And I was just like, hey, how daring are you? And he's like, you know what? Give me your weirdest. Like I'm willing. I'm up for a challenge. Give me your weirdest one. So I was like, okay, really? Are you sure? Because I'll give you one that's going to push you pretty hard. And he came back. He's like, bring it. So I sent him a Lord of Spirits by Stephen DeYoung, by Father Stephen DeYoung and Father Stephen Demick. And he came back and he listened to like 4 episodes, and he came back and he was like, I can't go there, but I love it. This is great stuff. And so it was just really being able to find different avenues to be able to, like, I'm not pushing anybody's agenda on you here. I'm just like, just go check it out and hear from someone from that perspective and try to understand what they're saying first, because I think it'll humanize the entire conversation a lot more when you hear that someone from their own perspective out from that in that way first, to not just automatically go in assuming I'm right. So you all have to be either stupid or deceived to believe differently than I do. And it'd be like, well, no, hang on. Some of us come to where we are through some very weird paths.
Mm-hmm. Well, and here's what I think in that. We don't know where people get their information from, and how they're interacting with other people of other faith. An example, I've had conversations with people who say the Orthodox or the Catholic, whatever, say they're the only church that can get saved. And if you're not in that church, then you are not saved, right? And so I have approached people like that in one particular instance I'm thinking of. And I said, well, where are you getting your information from? How do you know that? And he said, well, because I talked to this Orthodox somebody in authority in some form from Europe. And I'm like, okay, have you listened to these other places and the way that they articulate that? Because it doesn't sound like, I haven't heard a whole lot of Orthodox say, you are not in the church if you are not Orthodox. So have you listened to this side over here or this person over here? And I brought up a few examples and they're like, oh, no, I don't know anything about that. So depending on where they're getting their information, they might not even have a wrong way that they're presenting it, because it has been presented that way by someone somewhere. And that goes into what Josh was talking about, how you can have these different perspectives within tradition and the way that people talk about it differently. And one conversation, well, part of my episode for Genesis Marks the Spot next week, I'm kind of going into one aspect of this way of how people can say the same thing and it can not mean the same thing at all. And they can phrase it the same way, but it doesn't mean the same thing. So you have to get behind that meaning behind the phrases, which is really hard. And sometimes you can't do that because the person isn't here. Maybe they're dead. Maybe they wrote something. Maybe this was just hearsay. And so that's really kind of a tough thing. Like, how do you navigate the space when within that space there are very varied opinions just in and of itself?
Yeah. And again, I think to Josh's point when we started getting to, because I've run into, there's some hard people who tend to be harder lined, are harder to have those kinds of conversations with. I know I have a couple friends who are very hard line, like, we are the one true church, done, end of story. And I'm like, well, after spending some time getting to know them personally and other avenues outside of these conversations, then when that topic comes up, and then it's like, listen, you and I are friends, and you just told me that you think that I am not a believer, I'm not a Christian, because I don't think the same way that you do. And have you thought through exactly what you just said? Because you just condemned me to hell there, sir. And that takes, a lot of times that shocks them and takes them aback to be like, wait, I didn't mean that. Well, yes, you did, because this is what you said. And so, like, being able to, at certain points, then to start, when you make it more personal that way, the actual lived out implications of the theology that I'm trying to, apply in this conversation. Wait a second. All of a sudden, when that becomes personal, that gives me a lot more pause to be like, wait, do I really want to go there? Do I really want to go down that road? And to start kind of softening a little bit more of some of those harder line beliefs, because then it's someone I care about that's in the path of my unintended consequences of what I haven't thought through to the end.
The other thing also is that, and just to bring to the attention, we don't often think of it this way, but when we go online and we have discussions with these random people who, for all intents and purposes, are at best acquaintances, most likely strangers, when we read their words on the screen and we internalize them, we're giving voice. And when we give voice to a stranger, we do it without context. We do it usually without any kind of caution or concern. And when we do that, we often receive the words internally in our own heart as though they came from someone whose opinion matters to us indefinitely. And we react as though it comes from somebody whose opinion matters to us indefinitely, right? If my wife said, you know, you don't seem to know anything about the Bible, you must be an idiot, that would hurt my feelings a lot more than if some schmo on Facebook says it, simply because I've learned how to make that disconnect. A lot of people, when they go in there trying to have these conversations, because they take their thoughts and they take their doctrines and they take their stances so seriously, when they see someone make a generalized or even a very particular attack or challenge toward them, they feel it's aimed at them personally, and they react as though it's aimed at them personally. That's going to be something that guides the conversation far more than your words, and your actual conscious intent is going to be overshadowed by the fact that you're speaking from offense. And so recognizing that in and about ourselves is something that can draw us out of that offense and towards something that is going to be a much better starting place for the conversation from our own intent. And this is, again, safeguarding ourselves against being a terrible witness.
Yeah. And and understanding that, right or wrong, people take their ideas as their identities. And so if their ideas are attacked, then they are feeling like their identities are attacked. And even though that's not your intention, and we can't really necessarily make anybody adjust to that, but acknowledging that this is why they're reacting the way they are can kind of help to shift your thinking in the conversation and help understand, well, maybe I can respond this way because I see how deeply they're holding this part right here.
And be free with it. Also be free with your ability to compliment and bolster up the person you're talking to in an ordinate way. When I talk to somebody who speaks to me and they say things like, your view makes this happen about the Bible, it says this about God, and that is unexpected for me, it makes me feel this way. They're not being that explicit about it, but you can read from their responses that they're inflamed by my stance being so different from their own, that the first thing that comes across, if you're reading it that way, is they think lowly of me. What it should first say is they think highly of their belief system, and this matters to them in a way that they're ready to safeguard with their words as though they were fighting for their life. What you should do then is commend the person on how passionate that they are about the thing that they care about, and commend them on caring so much, because it's not everybody that cares enough to actually have the conversation. And when they do, a lot of the time they're doing it just to inflame somebody. And so it helps a lot. And I notice this is a pattern in St. Paul's writings, is you can sandwich a correction between two genuine compliments, and the spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down.
Yeah, I like Cindy's point here, because the way we present things and the way we respond, and keeping it not you focused, but me, saying, I feel this, this is how I am, can be really helpful.
And I think one of the things too that's been helpful for me in a lot of these conversations is because, one, I'm just naturally nice most of the time, unless you're Will Hess, and then I'm not. But everybody else I'm really nice to. Because I'm generally just nice, and because I'm genuinely curious, and so I will stop them and be like, "Tell me about that. Like, how did you get to that point? Tell me about your journey. Tell me about how you got to the places that you're thinking." And so not only does that, and I think this kind of goes to Troy's question there in his super chat a little bit. When I commented with a curiosity through kindness, then people start to kind of open up a little bit, and we'll talk more about the thought behind it and how they make those connections, or how you sorry, Josh's comment down there just distracted me. He wouldn't know, he's never been on my bad side. So but just that natural, honest curiosity of, okay, you think differently than I do. Tell me about that, because I'm curious. And that curiosity in that kind way I've discovered is very disarming for people. And then they start talking about how they developed that view, or that, they'll start talking about their uncle so and so, or grandma did this, or we went to these 6 churches and they all said these horrible things that scarred me for life, and so now I just think the opposite because I had this bad experience in VBS when I was 7. Like, you start to really get into where those things come from, and that they haven't, maybe this is a view that they're just taking out of defensive response to something that they've been through in their life, or they're just, in transition right now. And I used to think this, and I'm not sure where I'm going. So I'm just kind of pulling, like Josh said, the a la carte of this works for me right now. And it's like and this buffet tradition approach that it just can cause some confusion. So being curious and kind is also disarming, like, in a way that I can use to my advantage to really dig out where they're coming from and their different postures and presuppositions that they may not even be aware that they have sometimes, that people are like, oh, I didn't mean it that way when they explained to me. And hearing yourself say something out loud, and sometimes you're like, that's not what I meant to say. That's not what I thought. So maybe I'm not articulating myself properly, just by people asking questions and just being, but not from a defensive, like I'm out to prove you wrong or get you. I'm just curious. Like, tell me about that.
Right. Genuine curiosity as opposed to false curiosity, where you're asking the question in order for that gotcha moment of, well, here's how you're wrong in that, because, well, that's really easy to do sometimes. And sometimes I think we do that and we don't realize we're doing that just because we're in our own headspace. We need to step back for a second sometimes and go, oh, let's actually think about the other person and try and get in their headspace. That's hard.
It is. And I think sometimes it's one of the things that I'm starting to realize the more I'm interacting in the church hurt world, and coming out of healing from church hurt trauma myself, is that, in that need to be defensive and that need to protect myself, sometimes we kind of operate from this, like, so I have a 12-year-old corgi. She's actually almost 13 now. And we crate her at night just because of habit. When we first got her and I was training her to be a service dog, that was her signal that she was off duty, was crating at night. But now she will not function if I don't crate her at night. And it's just part of her mental routine. And sometimes in these like spaces, we're so used to being in these routines where we're in these crates from our own pasts and experience, we forget the door is open and we can step outside, and there's bigger, wider spaces to explore that aren't harmful. But if your only experience outside your crate is harm, you just want to stay in there and protect. And so it's hard to, encourage people to come out and to be like, it's okay. You can breathe out here. There's room to move out here. You don't have to be wrong out here. It just means that there's freedom to interact, and it's fun. Jesus is supposed to free us from these spaces and run around and have a good time and explore that freedom in Christ that we have. And getting people to taste that freedom in that wide open space really can help people, I think, restore some humanity in these conversations too.
The other thing that's really helpful for having the conversation is knowing where your own guardrails live and why they're there, so that you don't immediately start using your own personal preference as a club to stop someone else in their inquiry, right? And this is something that I learned when I came out of Calvinism, is that I learned that I had a very cultish kind of experience of being a Calvinist. And some of it was self-inflicted, if I'm fair, but a lot of it was the fact that I was surrounding myself with people and thinkers, especially in the online community, that were they were very like wholesale in their thoughts. They weren't allowing that freedom of space. They weren't allowing inquiry. They were trying to foster a mindset in which, if I can satisfy myself with a sufficient level of certainty about what I already know, I no longer need to inquire. And all of the dangerous zone is just, it's gone now, right? I built this castle to protect myself from the outside, but they don't realize what they built was actually a jail cell that locks from the inside. And all of the knocking on the door from the outside that tells you, come out, it's bigger out here, come out. It sounds more like a threat than like a rescue. And so those people don't respond as though you're asking them for, hey, you should continue to grow. You should continue to inquire, right? There's a, forgive me for using analogy, but when you have a fish and you put it in a size of a tank, the fish will only get as big as that tank allows. That is the same, well, not the same. That is analogous to what happens to our capacity to ask and to answer and to listen when we're having these theological discussions. We put ourselves in fishbowl mode and we cease to grow. And then we get embittered by people who bring new information, not because we don't want to grow, but because we've confused growth with error. We think that it's wrong or dangerous to question. And here's the thing. Truth is not that fragile, y'all. It's not. Truth is not fragile, and you shouldn't be spooked by asking the question. If I was like, hey, I'm not sure if I'm actually a 6 foot, Irish dude. Like I'm not sure. This person, they told me that I was Filipino and I was a woman. And now my whole world is shaken. It's like, no, well enough. You shouldn't be spooked, right? Truth is not going to break apart just because somebody asked a difficult question and you have to say, you know what? I don't know. Let me go figure out. Be comfortable with being wrong, or you'll always be wrong.
You'll always be wrong. Yes. Yeah. I think a lot about this book I talked about early on in my podcast called Think Again. And the whole idea behind it is to be less of a pastor? Okay, I can't remember the 3 things. There's 3 things in the book that we kind of tend to be. The pastor is the one who is propping up the ideas that they've already had. And the lawyer is the one who's trying to find the evidence to prop up what they believe. And what we should be doing is being the scientist to try and falsify what we think. Like that's the whole purpose of and pursuit of science. You have an idea, you're trying to falsify it to get a better idea. So the idea isn't to get to perfection and truth of, well, we're done now, but to be less wrong. And I love that.
And I like the idea of, this idea of truth is not fragile, because I think sometimes depending on where you land in the spectrum of having to label and categorize things, the more labeled and categorized systems become, the harder it is to be flexible in interacting with truth, because sometimes you're just like, well, if what you said is true, it doesn't fit my definition because of this box that I'm in here. That can be really threatening, because if I'm wrong about this little label in this box, if this ology is wrong, then maybe all the rest of my ologies are wrong. And then my whole entire house of cards comes crashing down. Like it struck me as really funny when at my second semester at the school I was at previously, I took a systematic theology class, and the guy who the professor who taught that, he was Pentecostal. He was a great guy, but he stood up the first day. It was me and a bunch of guys in there, and he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, I am here to tell you with 100% certainty, as a well-published systematic theologian, systematic theology is garbage." And I was like, "Wait, what?"
I'd be like, "Yes, this is my kind of class."
Like it was really fun, because what he was trying to do is to get the whole, it was a really good ecumenical mix in that class as well. And so he was like, we're going to leave all of that outside at the door. We're going to talk about some of the topics that happen in the different ologies, but we're not getting stuck in anybody's ology. And so it was forcing everyone to step outside of whatever their label or tradition was and interact with the idea of it, the idea itself and the concept itself, which turned out to be really interesting. And everybody walked away from that either stronger in their position because they were forced to interact with the idea in the raw, or having changed their position because they were forced to interact with the idea in the raw. So it was really a good lesson too, to pull out, to be, it's okay to be wrong about one thing, because it isn't going to collapse my entire life isn't going to collapse because I'm wrong about one thing. But we don't, I think, at least in American West, we don't learn how to be wrong. And so when we don't know how to be wrong, that means that automatically, instead of me being wrong, then Josh has to be the bad guy because he's the one to be wrong, obviously, because I'm not. So I automatically discount all of Josh's opinions and his value and his sincerity and his holding of his beliefs because they conflict with mine, and I can't be wrong. So, that's again with the posturing that you come in with that we don't even sometimes realize that we have, that if I have to be right, that makes you automatically from the get-go wrong. And then I never hear a word you actually want to say.
Yeah. But then this is frustrating to me. And this is me speaking about my own mental process. You start a conversation like this, and it's like I'm trying really hard because this conversation kind of forces the perspective of, hey, I need to look at myself. So I'm trying to do it a little bit more in this conversation. And yet I still notice that I'm like thinking about other people. And I'm like, here's the thing that's the problem. And and it still becomes this outside factor. And it's just a strange thing to notice in conversations like this for myself, because I'm so hyper-focused on, here's the framework, here's the other person, here's where I am, here's the conversation dynamic. And I'm kind of looking at it in that it's probably not really completely objective, but more objective than I would be within the conversation itself. And yet, even in this conversation, when I'm thinking about that, it still gets to the point of where I'm thinking of an us versus them dynamic. Just something I noticed is in the way that I'm thinking about things here in the conversation.
One of the things that I think would be useful, and it is a bit of a joke, but it also is something that I think kind of hammers home things easily, because what we're talking about is something that, again, we need to be able to zoom out, right? One thing that I've said for probably the last 6 years or so pretty consistently, and I still stand by it, I don't think anybody has put a metaphysical crowbar strong enough to flip this idea and prove it false. If you cannot live as though your ideas are true, they're probably not. If you cannot embody the resolve of your theology, it is probably incorrect, right? And so one of the things that I actually posted on Facebook the other day that I made a couple years ago that I thought was really, really funny, but a lot of people seem to misunderstand it, is this right here: systematic theology and participatory theology. Okay. Kind of the words kind of define themselves. Systems, which are what Amber was just talking about, are things that are internally consistent and coherent, but internally reliant, right? Participation is something else. It's something that's alive and it's free flowing and it's moving, and it doesn't have many qualities that remain consistent across time. And so it's not something that you can look at as though it were a snapshot and pretend like it contains all of reality. Okay. Systems don't like that, because systems are made so that you can articulate what you have to say rather than do anything about it. Systems aren't something to do, they're something to explain. Okay. And so there's a difference between having a system, which is an abstraction, it's an idea, and it's not something you embody. A system is something you use to articulate. And there is a huge difference between putting your faith into words and putting your faith into actions. And I think what we do is we often confine the idea of the faith to the propositional understanding that we can put it into words, rather than the effectiveness of putting the faith into action, which is something that makes it real. It is more real when you do it and incarnate it than when you say it. That means that, and this is in the same sense, prophecy is so beautiful, but it is not real until it comes to fruition. Christ is real. Why? Because he came incarnate. The Messiah was real when he arrived, not when he was spoken about.
Right.
And so there's a huge, huge difference in the way that we live out our theology versus the way we explain our theology. Not that you shouldn't be able to explain it, because heavens knows we're on here talking for an hour. We should be able to explain some things, right? But that is literally not where the life is. That is not where the sap is. There is no blood in your words. Don't get it twisted. A lot of people try to play this game by saying, well, God made the world with words. God spoke. Christ is the word of God. You know, there's a difference, even in the Greek, between spoken word and word, as in logos. And I don't think that we as modern folks appreciate that distinction quite enough, because we think that if we can speak wisdom, we are wise. Nah, friend, when you can live wisdom, you are wise. The fool is the one who speaks, not the wise man. If you haven't read Proverbs in a while, please go read Proverbs, because it warns you this, like, consistently. The fool has many words, right? That's the thing. I'll stop there for a second, because I do want to get to Troy's question. I think it's really relevant, but I don't want to like tirade.
Well, I just wanted to build on what you just said there, because I remember in Hebrew class, we got quite the lecture about not building your theology on grammar alone. And she got to talking about that the nature of language itself. Language just develops naturally. It just happens. You encounter something in your environment. You don't know what that is. You have to create an idea. You have to create a word to describe the thing that you're interacting with, whether it's tangible or intangible, it doesn't matter. But language just develops with a natural flow, depending on where you are, where you live, your context. Are you nomadic? Are you semi-nomadic? Are you, as you look at the development of human language, right? But grammar, and what we sit down when we learn a new language that's foreign to us, grammar is the explanation that is put on as an external to understand a language that is not our own. We intuitively, as native born English speakers, understand how English works. We can speak in English without taking an English class. We understand the language of the dynamics of our own language. To write down for somebody else, you kind of have to learn some of those rules, but it really only becomes an issue when I sit down and try to learn Greek or Hebrew or Spanish or something that's not native to me. I need an externally imposed system to make sense of how that language thinks, so that I can interact in how that language thinks. And that really is another one of those things that has stuck with me, not just in language and learning Hebrew in translation, but in understanding how other people think. Because to me, I'm imposing an external structure on to try to understand their point of view and how they think.
Do you have anything to add to that, Carrie?
Well, it gives me a question. I'm trying to think of how I would put it. So you have the language, you have the external structure. I like how you're explaining that. You're explaining it really well. So when two people come together in a conversation, we have different perspectives automatically. And part of the problem in communication is that you got to find connections. You want the other person. It would be ideal if the other person could fit into your structure, and then we're all good. We don't have to explain anything. That's not how it works, though. And so sometimes there is, well, I guess my question is there something external in conversation that kind of constrains things, or is there not? Is there something that should be there, and when it breaks down, that's when we have more conflict? I don't know. That's my question.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really great question, because it kind of it digs at this is a very cosmic corner. You just zoomed out a whole lot. When people have an issue communicating and it's not a language barrier, it's usually an expectation barrier. I think that's probably what it is most often, is people have an expectation that when they say something, it means the same as when someone else says something. And we might be using the same vocabulary in a different dictionary, as our friend Leighton Flowers says. Right. And so it's not necessarily the case that when you're talking to somebody and you say the word grace or the word love or the word justice or the word atonement, that they mean even remotely what you meant when you said it, or when they said it, that you should assume that you know in the fact what they meant. And so a lot of the biggest part that happens in these conversations, and I think that's one of the things that I think I've found a great strength in, is being able to just ask, what do you mean? Why do you think that? Those two questions are going to save you a whole lot of heartache if you employ them in the right way. If you ask somebody, you said this thing, what do you mean? Or if you said, somebody said, I believe this, this, and that, they have a really strong stance. You ask them, why do you believe that? If what they give back to you is nothing more than like a piety talk about dismissal of like, well, I read scripture and this is what scripture says, so I believe scripture. It's like, okay, scripture doesn't have a larynx, and I'm pretty sure it didn't make noises to you. So when you read it, you understood it to be saying this. You have an interpretive framework. You might have to walk them all the way back to that and ask the appropriate questions. Sometimes it's asking, again, what do you mean? What do you even mean when you say those words? We have a lot of things that are just assumed, and we presuppose them. We don't mean to. Not that presuppositions are bad or are wrong. They're not. They're the building blocks of reason, just like intuition is, right? But if you don't share an intuition with somebody because you don't share the experience that they've had, then you need to come back to something that's simply the clarifying question. What do you mean by that? And why do you think that? Right? And then you allow them, like Amber said, you have that moment of genuinely curious questioning, and then you allow the space for a real answer. And if the person is not giving you a real answer, then it's probably because they don't really understand the question you're asking.
Or they don't really understand their own theology either. Sometimes that's the problem too. They're just regurgitating.
And fair enough. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they might not. Again, the main question that happens, I think, in like the modern Protestant thing is, well, how could you believe something like that? It's obviously heretical. It's like, you don't have a firm framework by which you define heresy other than I don't like it. Okay, so we should probably use better language. So if we, as the people who are actively aware of this problem and are trying to be a remedy to it, can be better at using language like a tool, then the people who use language as a weapon are no longer as threatening to us. And we can have these conversations. You know what I mean? Like, it's really, I think a lot of it is it's really a faulty expectation walking into the conversation that vocabulary is what it is to you. It's probably not. Vocabulary is very ambiguous. And usually when people use big words, like we find in theology, they learned that word in the context of a conversation rather than from a dictionary. They learned that word by listening to their favorite hero teacher use it repetitively, and that gave it meaning. And so you need to be able to, and again, truth is not fragile, so you can ask the question, what are you talking about? What do you even mean when you say that? You use that word. What did you mean when you said it? And that's something that I find that when people don't want to have that kind of clarity, it's because their ideas are allergic to clarity and they run from it. That's a person you're not going to have a fruitful conversation with. And so a lot of the times, if you get over the idea that you're afraid to ask, what do you mean? Because you might be proven wrong. Like Carrie said, it's like a good hypothesis is tried to be proven wrong. That's what makes it a good hypothesis, is that it withstood that critique. That's what makes it a good hypothesis. If your ideas are not going to withstand critique, what you have is not good ideas. What you have is wishful thinking.
Yeah, and that also brings up another interesting dynamic to the conversation, at least to me. And I was watching Carrie's segment the other day on Irenaeus, and thinking back into my patristics class and in other conversations I've been having lately, like, this word heretic has been thrown around so much, it's basically meaningless. But, if you look at the early church, we talked about a lot in patristics class. Irenaeus was like heresy guy. He wrote tons and tons and tons on heresy. But usually in those conversations, from how I understand it, they were going after the ideas and not the people themselves. And when you got in trouble is when you refused to abandon the bad idea or the bad teaching or the bad belief. It wasn't the person themselves that was the problem. It was the thought or the idea or the belief that was the problem. And the inability to abandon that bad teaching is what got you in trouble. And you were removed to give yourself a chance to think about changing your position on that stance of that bad belief. And you were not let back in until you were willing to come back into alignment with the truth. And if you were left in you didn't get to anathema until a whole lot of attempts to try to bring you back in to change your mind, because the idea was the problem, not the person.
So I have a question. What do you think about the fact, though, that a lot of it is that they were building ideas in community, right?
Right.
One of the people I mentioned the other night was, I forget his name. He wrote a book on Irenaeus, and explained, and was talking about the conversation in light of, are they excluding the heretics? Or are the heretics already excluding themselves into a separate group? They've gone over here and said, we disagree with you guys, so we're going to go make this community over here. So it still seems to be like a identity thing. But so is this, I guess the question is in my mind is we're seeing it as an individualistic thing, not the communal identity.
Right.
Where is the line there? And is it different today?
I don't know. So this takes me back to one of the things that we've been that I saw them arguing a lot about on Biblical Rogues Gallery before I joined it, and it's been kind of an ongoing thing that keeps coming up. Is who is the interlocutor in the Book of Romans? And people have a whole lot of opinions about it. And then there's this two-part Romans thing has become really popular, and I'm starting to get to the point where I'm starting to disagree a little bit with all of them, because if you look at the entirety of the canon of Paul's writings, he cares about two things a whole heck of a lot. Number one, unity. Well, number two, unity. Number two is unity. And number one is the gospel message. And when someone is in error in the gospel message and it disrupts the community, he's vicious. He promotes community and unity above everything, unless it threatens the message of the gospel and that disrupts the community. And then he goes flat out to name names and says, abandon these people to hell, because the corruption of the gospel message that disrupts the community and the unity of the community to Paul was the number one thing. So, I would land in there in that, trying to address it. And I don't think that changes.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good example of thinking about it, because we tend to jump to the post-New Testament time thinking about heresies rather than landing in the New Testament first, seeing how was that actually being worked out and all of that good stuff.
So we do have a question from Troy.
Okay.
He sent another super chat that I think is really great, that I want to get to. I do have to hop soon, but I do want to get to that before we start to wind down. So he asked, please explain the difference between truth and fact. Holy smokes. I need to I want to have an entire cosmic corner on this, because I feel like
I knew you were going to say that. I knew it.
Dude, it is one of the mainstay problems as to why people that I've had listen to a Cosmic Corner episode come at me afterward and be like, I disagree because blah, 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 blah. Usually what they do is they try to confine both of those things into one category and pretend like they're identical. Okay, truth and fact are not identical. Truth is higher than fact. And I don't mean locally. I mean, it is actually, in an ontological sense, more real than facthood. Facthood lacks a quality that truth has. It is aboutness. Facts are not about anything. Facts are data points that lack context. Truth is the context that makes facts true about something, right? And so in order for facts to become truth, they need to be nested in a value, which is something that usually happens within the framework of a narrative. I'm at A, I want to be at B. In order to get there, I need to have the transition between them. In order for that to happen, some things become relevant and other things become irrelevant. When facts become relevant, you can use them in truth. When facts cease to be relevant, they simply stop existing to you. And so truth is something that makes the world what it is. Facts are not. Facts are too small to contain the world. And there's simply too many of them for you to attend to. And so they're an atomized sea of nothing.
Yeah, I would explain that as they're not incidental, but they're an accident rather than the framework, right? Like in another circumstance, the accident of the fact could be completely different and the truth would remain.
It reminds me when my daughter was in high school and she took probable statistics, prob stats, and she came home one day, and my husband's an engineer, and so he deals in STEM and math, and that's his realm and what he does. And she came home and she was like, "Dad, did you know math lies?" And I was like, "This will be a fun conversation." And so she's talking about, well, we just learned how they can use numbers and change numbers around and use these facts of these numbers to make them say what you can make it say whatever you want. She's like, and she's going into like, marketing and manipulating and like for, like they're just doing all these calculations of, if you want this grant for this, you need to have your numbers to make, to say this way. So you're sampling this kind of data. And she was just like going through, and she's like, had her poor little mind just blown, the fact that math can lie. And my husband's like, well, hold on, math itself isn't lying, but it's the way that you're using those numbers to portray what your desire is that is honest or not. It is truth or not, depending on the way that you're taking, cherry picking the numbers and putting them together and framing those. So the facts themselves are neither truth nor untruth, but it's the way that they're used and applied that really makes the difference there.
And that seems to hit on Troy's previous question about presuppositions and underlying sub differences that people have, right? And it can be lies, or it can just simply be different. And when it's different and you're acting like fact is truth, then that difference is a lie. When it's not, it's just a difference within a different narrative framework.
Yep.
That's right.
Well, it's been an hour and 15. And so I think I've reached a good point where we have hashed out quite a bit here. So if we want to go around and just do some closing thoughts, Carrie, we'll start with you, and then Josh, and then I'll try to land the plane and wrap us up here a little bit. So Carrie.
Yeah, well, hopefully the conversation helped to get a few little points in people's minds to think, well, how can I engage in conversation? Because you can't control anybody else. You can only control yourself. And it's really interesting that a lot of the points of this conversation makes me think of like interpersonal psychology just in general. Like, what is intimacy? What is being vulnerable? And you have to have that in order to have a good conversation. And yet people are really concerned, just like this is a big thing these days, about safe spaces. And what does that mean, right? I have to have a safe space in order to be vulnerable. And they think that that just automatically happens, but you kind of have to make it yourself. You have to make that space yourself. And it's okay to, like, just because somebody's pushing against you doesn't make that an unsafe space. It's the question of how are you reacting to what's going on? Like, sometimes you do have to step out, and sometimes you do have to leave the space, but sometimes you can just kind of shift your mental framework and the way that you are thinking about the other person and the situation you're in. So that's kind of one thing that was really tracking, I thought, throughout this whole conversation.
I like that a lot. I really like that. If I were to reemphasize anything, it would be don't get caught up in the small details before you've established the full picture of what it is that you're looking at. And if you don't have a full picture, be willing to recognize your shortcoming in not having a full picture, and be willing to be wrong. Because the sooner that you're willing to say, I'm probably wrong, the sooner you'll actually stop being wrong, because you'll have a better footing in asking the right questions, allowing yourself the freedom to say, I probably don't know. And, like, one of the most comforting things in the world for me having these conversations is to start by saying, what the hell do I know? Probably nothing. I'll assume the person I'm talking to has something worth saying. That means it's worth listening to. And if I do that and I treat them that way, they'll catch on to that, because people, and this is something that I learned in sales, people like being asked questions about themselves. It's actually rather cool. People like getting asked about themselves, and they're totally willing to explain themselves if you give them the space and the freedom to do that. That's part of what Carrie was just talking about, is you illustrate that freedom, you illustrate that comfortability and that ability to be vulnerable by initiating that vulnerability. You ask the question and allow the space. If they're not willing to be reciprocal about that, fine. Maybe it's the wrong investment. Go to somebody else. But that doesn't mean it's the wrong way to invest. Trust is expensive. Okay? It is. It's because bravery is big. Lacking trust is not a virtue. You should be able to be not frivolous, but you should learn how to be hilariously giving, as Apostle Paul would say, with your time and attention, if you can trust somebody to have a real conversation. Sometimes that means testing out the waters, but sometimes it means playing the long game and investing your time and attention into a person because they matter as a person. And the other thing that I would emphasize is truth and fact distinction is something that I think lies at the bottom of a lot of our problem, because we try too hard to make explicit with our language in a really intellectual and systematic sort of way, when in reality, one of the greatest bridges between one mind and another is, in fact, your testimony or a good analogy or a metaphor. Don't be afraid to use what God has given you. Don't think that you have to bring everything that's intellectual on an intellectual playing field. Sometimes that's the wrong approach, right? And if you want an example, just before we hop off, if you want an example of something that's truth but not fact, right? Christ is the door. That doesn't mean he has hinges. That is true, but it is not factual. Okay? It just isn't. I love my wife. I love my wife with my life. I've come to learn from Ephesians 5 that she's not mine, she is me. That is not fact, it is truth.
Also, I am God's.
She's God's. She knows. She knows. She belongs to God. It's not my property.
I am your gift, and our children is our gift. I belong to Jesus Christ, and so do our kids. We're just lent to you.
Pastor Emily over here. But yeah,
we need to get her on here.
Yes, I saw Tyler brought Lacey on. Lacey on, and now I feel obligated to get my wife to come on. And
I want to see Emily needs to come join the women, man. Get her on an episode with the ladies. That's what we need to do.
Absolutely.
My apologies if you guys are still live.
Yeah, we're live. You're live too now.
Great. I suppose I'm live off camera. I've been preaching. Y'all don't know.
That's amazing. I think I would say to just always remember, whether we're talking about ideas or systems or individually disagreeing with someone, that there is always a soul on the other end of that conversation, whether it is the implied group that you're talking about or the actual individual you're face to face talking to. Kindness and curiosity go an awful long way to preserving the fact that there is a soul that is being talked about, and that should be something we always try to keep in our minds when we're dealing with someone, or talking in these, deeper theologically oriented conversations, or some of the conversations we're going to be having on the Ecclesia Project, and interacting with different traditions and different traditions interacting with each other, that they all represent people who have a soul and are sincerely trying in their own way to have a relationship with Christ. And to do anything other than to remember that is to dishonor the entire conversation. And I think representing the name of God well, in those conversations. So that's the only thing that I would say there. So Carrie, what have you got coming up on? My brain just went out the window. Gosh.
Well, on Pilgrims
Pilgrims
in
into
the
Holy Land. There we go.
You're good. We are going to be talking about the book of First Enoch and a little bit of what it is, maybe reading some of it, I don't know, and really want to kind of talk about its impact on the early church a little bit there, because I just went through a whole reading of the Book of the Watchers and the Parables of Enoch on my podcast, Genesis Marks the Spot. I kind of did a little bit of a commentary next to that, and that was pretty fun because it's a work that has a lot of impact to the New Testament and the way it's thinking. So that's kind of what we're trajecting for that.
That sounds like a good project. You should send me that, Carrie, because I totally want to listen to that now, actually.
Yeah, it's good. It's good because we don't realize how much that helps us to kind of get our heads into the space, and especially the space of the Messiah and expectations there.
Yeah, that's what's up.
Right. Josh, what do you have coming up on Cosmic Corner?
Jalen and I just had a really awesome conversation about racial identity, and we do want to revisit that. But before we get there, I want to try to take some time in the upcoming season to really explore some more about the problem of evil, but employ the same narrative structure that I've been using to explore some other ideas, and look at why it is that God has created a world that is good in the beginning, good in the end, so big it can contain villainy, but that it doesn't win. Right. And so I really want to zoom out and look at why it is that God made the allowance for what has gone wrong so that redemption can be the beautiful reality that it is. And I think that's something that's definitely worth pursuing more. As far as right now, tentatively, the next Cosmic Corner will be on the 28th, and we'll probably be talking about the problem of evil through a narrative lens. I'm not entirely sure which facet of evil we'll be talking about yet, but I have a feeling that it's probably going to be more than one conversation about that, but we will be revisiting the racial identity as well. So that's something that's coming down the tubes for Cosmic Corner. It's going to be good. It's going to be great. You're going to love it. It's going to be great. The best you've ever seen. You've never seen anything like it.
Oh, that's awesome. Let me think. I've got, when deep calls deep, I don't even know. I think that I've gotten a lot of questions about Ezekiel and Daniel lately. So I think an Ezekiel series is coming up because that's my favorite book of the Bible. And how could I not? I've been dying to do an Ezekiel series, and I get more and more convinced all the time how pivotal and fundamental Ezekiel 37 is to everything. So I really want to dig into the book.
Are you going to talk about aliens? Are you going to talk about aliens and UFOs when we talk about Ezekiel's inaugural vision of aliens? Aliens!
I hate you. No, just kidding. We're yeah, well, maybe.
That was in my first big research paper in 8th grade, okay?
Yeah, we'll be talking about that because it comes up, and people wrote dissertations that got PhDs on the fact that Ezekiel chapter 1 proves that aliens exist, and it's lovely. Anyway, so yeah. And then on Hebrew Bible Breakdown, Courtney and I are just getting ready to dive into some things about how Hebrew thinks and about what is Torah, and getting some more, plowing our way into how to interact with the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament, and interlinking that with the New Testament and what that does. And then on the Faith Unaltered segment, Monday, we have somebody coming at like 9:30 in the morning, but I don't remember who it is. And I don't want to say the wrong name, because I can't remember. So Monday morning, we
It's
have
a surprise guest.
It's a
okay?
surprise guest. Yes,
There you go.
I think I remember who it is, but I don't want to drop a name and have it be incorrect. So, in the spirit of not making myself look bad by remembering wrong, I'm just going to say it's a surprise. Somebody's coming on Monday morning, and we're just continuing to explore this ecclesia idea and what is the church, and from different points of view, and just establishing kind of a baseline of where are different traditions in this conversation, so that we can move forward in having I think better, more informed conversations as moving forward is really kind of our goal. So we've got some, and again, we've got the lineup of people that we have coming on in the next few weeks is going to be really amazing, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So it'll be something people are going to want to tune into. So you definitely want to check that out. So but that I think, if Josh, if you want to go ahead and close us out, I think we are got one in the books here, and we can end it for the day.
Good game, everybody. I get to say I'm pleased. This was fantastic. This was fantastic. I'll definitely be coming back to this and making some really awesome treasure-filled gold small clips out of this, and shorts and stuff. Be on the lookout so you can share to your friends and neighbors. This was a really fun time. This was a blessing. I hope everybody that's been listening is just as blessed and had a good time. If you're listening afterward, leave your comments for us under below. We'll definitely be reading them. If you'd like to support Faith Unaltered, please go ahead and either click the subscribe button if you're already subscribed. If you'd like to help support us financially, you click the join button and become a member of Faith Unaltered. If you'd like to do a one-time donation, we got our link tree in the comment or in the description down there. If you want to do that, and most importantly, if you'd like to support our ministry in the most practical sense, please pray for us. We are all continually on Satan's radar. He's always trying to find ways to get us to be quiet and disqualify us, and it would be really so much of a blessing if you'd remember us in your prayers. That being said, thanks for watching. This has been another episode of Faith Unaltered. Good night. God bless, and stay like Christ.